Greetings, people. This is the Mexican American channel. Very glad you could join me. Hit the like button to support the channel and subscribe if you haven't subscribed yet. This is the fight of the century. We have a culture of resistance. Mexican American culture is a culture of resistance. Our existence is resistance. We are the descendants of indigenous American Indians. Mexicans generally have indigenous American DNA due to historical mixing of indigenous populations with European colonizers and, to a lesser extent, like other groups like African and Asians. We are the cultivators. We are the innovators. We are the culture. What makes us so different, so rare, so unique is the fact we talk about the world and what's going on in it, while everyone else is stumbling around trying to figure out what they want to do. We have to be able to read the weather in all directions. White supremacy is the most dangerous ideology on the planet, and it's cancer that continues to spread. The best we can do is figure out how to navigate the many forms of hate that manifest in different parts of the country and world. White supremacy is living and breathing. It's always been active in our schools, our streets, our workplaces. To deny its existence at this point is disrespectful and downright naive. White supremacy is a robust, nearly impenetrable system. It's threaded into the fabric of our nation. The Chicano civil rights movement was a social and political movement during the 1960s and 1970s that aimed to empower Mexican Americans and advocate for their rights, including restoring land, improving labor and education, and achieving political representation. It was a response to systemic discrimination and emerged from various struggles, from farm workers' rights under figures like Cesar Chavez to student protests against educational inequality. Our people were advocating for land rights that were historically neglected after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and fighting for better wages and working conditions for farm workers. They demanded an education that validated Mexican American culture and history and challenging inequalities in funding and curriculum. They increased political power and representation for Mexican Americans and challenged the systemic discrimination they faced. The Mexican American case that was a blueprint for integration was Mendez versus Westminster, a 1947 federal court ruling that declared the segregation of Mexican American students in California schools unconstitutional. This case, filed by 5 Mexican American families, prohibited the segregation of Latino children and set a crucial precedent for future school integration efforts. The success of Mendez versus Westminster in California helped pave the way for the national school desegregation movement, influencing the later Supreme Court case Brown versus Board of Education. Look it up for yourself if you don't believe it. We got to put our history in proper context. Our people pushed, pulled, and strived. Our people shed blood, sweat, and tears on this soil. Mexico had abolished slavery in 1837, and its government refused to sign a treaty with the U.S. to return escaped slaves. Many enslaved African Americans fled to Mexico. Though slave catchers from the U.S. would pursue them, Mexicans would intervene to protect the African Americans on Mexican soil. After the Mexican-American War, 1846 through 1848, Mexicans were classified as white after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo to make them eligible for U.S. citizenship, which was legally restricted to free white persons at the time. The treaty granted citizenship to Mexicans who stayed in the annexed territories, which was considered a form of naturalization through treaty. However, this legal classification of white did not guarantee social equality or protect against discrimination, and they were often still subject to segregation and violence. For the haters still chewing on crayons, pay attention. To become U.S. citizens, Mexicans were given legal whiteness because the Naturalization Act of 1790 explicitly limited citizenship to white persons. The treaty allowed for Mexicans to become citizens by treaty, effectively making them white by law. This legal status did not translate into social equality. Mexicans faced ongoing discrimination and segregation, with many signs and policies that created a system of segregation. Despite being legally white, their racial identity was often complex and fluid. They were frequently treated as a separate, non-white category, and some were able to pass as white, while others were officially categorized as non-white on the U.S. Census. We also served in the American Civil War. Mexicans and Mexican Americans fought in the American Civil War on both the Union and Confederate sides. Thousands of Mexican Americans joined the Union Army, particularly from California and New Mexico. We also participated working on the railroads. Mexicans, along with Mexican Americans and Mexican immigrants, were instrumental in building the railroads of the U.S. Southwest, with an estimated two-thirds of the track labor force in the region being of Mexican descent by the 1920s. These laborers, known as traqueros, were essential to railroad construction and maintenance from the late 19th century through the early 20th century. Following the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad and after the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, a labor shortage occurred, leading to the recruitment of Mexican and Mexican American men for railroad work. By 1922, Mexican workers constituted 85% of the railroad workforce in the Southwest. Their work was crucial for connecting markets, facilitating agriculture, and developing the region's infrastructure. In 1917, U.S. health officials in El Paso, Texas, initiated a program to disinfect Mexican individuals crossing the border, primarily due to an unfounded fear of a typhus epidemic, a disease spread by lice. Mexican men, women, and children were forced to strip naked, undergo inspections, and have their clothes and bodies treated with various chemicals, including a mixture of kerosene and soap and later poisonous Zyklon B. The process was highly demeaning. Male officers were secretly photographing nude women. On January 28, 1917, Carmelita Torres refused to submit to the procedure, sparking a mass protest of thousands of Mexican workers that temporarily shut down the border crossing at the Santa Fe Bridge. Despite the protests, the delousing practices continued for decades, well into the 1950s and even the 1960s during the Bracero program, using other pesticides like DDT. The U.S. methods were even studied and praised in a 1938 German scientific journal, and later influenced the design of the gas chambers used during the Holocaust. La Matanza Massacre was a period of state-sanctioned racial violence against ethnic Mexicans and Mexican Americans in Texas between 1910 and 1920, primarily carried out by the Texas Rangers and vigilante groups. This era, also referred to as the Hour of Blood, involved massacres, lynchings, and the denial of due process. The violence was fueled by heightened racial tensions during the Mexican Revolution and the bandit wars along the U.S.-Mexico border, particularly peaking in the summer and fall of 1915. Estimates for the number of victims range from hundreds to potentially thousands of people, many of whom were innocent farmers and residents. The primary perpetrators were members of the Texas Rangers, local law enforcement, and Anglo-Texan vigilante groups who often acted with impunity and the implicit approval of state officials. For decades, this history was largely suppressed. No one was ever held criminally accountable for the homicides committed during this period. The Mexican repatriation was a series of forced deportations and coercive voluntary departures of approximately 2 million people of Mexican descent, including many U.S. citizens from the United States between 1929 and 1936. Driven by the Great Depression and a desire to create jobs for white Americans, authorities rounded up individuals through raids, public pressure, and threats, even taking people from hospitals. The stated goal was to reduce unemployment by removing Mexicans from the workforce to create American jobs for real Americans, an idea advanced by President Herbert Hoover. Families were separated, and people were deprived of their citizenship and property. It didn't stop there. Then again in Operation Wetback. Operation Wetback was a U.S. immigration enforcement campaign launched in 1954 by the Eisenhower administration to apprehend and deport undocumented Mexican immigrants. The U.S. Border Patrol, led by General Joseph May Swing, used militaristic tactics, including 12-man command teams, buses, planes, and temporary processing centers. Agents set up roadblocks and conducted raids on farms, factories, and Mexican-American neighborhoods, often demanding identification from people who appeared to be Mexican. Many of those removed were U.S. citizens or legal residents who were caught up in the indiscriminate sweeps. The conditions for deportees were often inhumane. Many were transported in overcrowded buses, trains, and cargo ships, some compared to slave ships, with reports of people dying from sunstroke and other causes. Riots were a series of riots that took place in 1943 in Los Angeles, California, United States, involving American servicemen stationed in Southern California and young Latino and Mexican American city residents. American servicemen and white Angelenos attacked and stripped children, teenagers, and youths who wore zoot suits, ostensibly because they considered the outfits, which were made from large amounts of fabric, to be unpatriotic during World War II. Similar racist violence against Latinos happened in Chicago, San Diego, Oakland, Philadelphia, and New York City as well. The Squadron 201, also known as the Aztec Eagles, was a Mexican Air Force squadron that fought in World War II, serving alongside the U.S. Army Air Forces in the Pacific. The squadron is notable for being the only Mexican military unit to serve outside of its national borders and for its combat role, which included close air support and bombing missions. They flew P-47D Thunderbolt fighter aircraft and completed 795 combat sorties during their service. Mexican-American soldiers experienced significant racism after returning home from World War II, despite their service. They faced discrimination in public spaces, were denied services like funerals, and continued to be treated as second-class citizens, which led them to organize and demand equal rights. Even after serving, Mexican-American veterans were being denied service at restaurants, movie theaters, and other public establishments. They continued to face segregation in housing and education. A key example is the case of Felix Longoria, a Mexican-American soldier killed in action. When his body was returned to his hometown in Texas, the only funeral home in the area refused to host his wake, stating that local white residents would not approve. This injustice highlighted the deep-seated prejudice they faced, even in death. The indignities of their post-war treatment fueled a new wave of activism among Mexican-American veterans. They were no longer willing to accept second-class citizenship and use the experience of fighting for their country to demand the rights they had been denied. This led to the formation of organizations like the American GI Forum, which fought for veterans' benefits and challenged discrimination and helped ignite the broader Mexican-American civil rights movement. Mexican-American history is American history. Don't let anyone tell you who you are. We know exactly who we are. We are the descendants of Olmecs, Mayans, Mexica, Incas, Zapotec, Mixtec, Purepecha, Otomi, Totonac, Raramuri, Yaquis, and many, many other tribes. I'm proud of my people's history. I'm proud of my culture, and I will remain proud. We are radically different from everyone else. We are built different, and I take pride of my culture. Our ancestors fought with the uncivilized Europeans. We are still dealing with them. You are dealing with a beast. You are dealing with animals. You are not dealing with people. You are dealing with subhumans. You are dealing with white supremacy. It's essential for us to have these conversations. People, do you understand that America has engaged in a strategy of ignoring our history in the desperate hopes that it will eventually get lost to time and vanish? They have been hoping desperately that our history disappeared. That's been the hope. That's been the goal. That's why it's very essential for us to talk about our history. That's the purpose of this channel. Don't let anyone lie about your history. Be aware that others may have agendas or limited perspectives that lead them to narrate your history in a way that doesn't reflect the truth. Don't let them muddy the water. Not just white supremacy, but even by racist black cults on social media that are trying to rewrite your history with their propaganda. We got to gatekeep our culture. A candle loses nothing by lighting another candle. Gunslinger Francisco Pancho Villa was a Mexican revolutionary, guerrilla leader, and politician. He was a key figure in the Mexican Revolution, which forced out President and dictator Porfirio Diaz and brought Francisco Madero to power in 1911. Emiliano Zapata was a Mexican revolutionary and guerrilla leader. He was a leading figure in the Mexican Revolution, the main leader of the People's Revolution in the Mexican state of Morelos, and the inspiration of the agrarian movement called Zapatismo. Jovita Idar was a Mexican-American journalist, teacher, political activist, and civil rights worker who championed the cause of Mexican Americans and Mexican immigrants. Against the backdrop of the Mexican Revolution, which lasted a decade from 1910 through 1920, she worked for a series of newspapers, using her writing to work towards making a meaningful and effective change. She began her career in journalism at her father's newspaper in Laredo, Texas, her hometown. Her father, Nicasio, was a newspaper editor and a civil rights advocate. From an early age, Idar was exposed to journalism and political activism. During this time, the Mexican-American community in Texas also frequently faced violence and lynching. The paper was a source of news and activism for Mexican-American rights. She often wrote articles speaking about racism and supporting the revolution in Mexico. In 1911, Aydar and her family organized the first Mexican Congress to unify Mexicans across the border to fight injustice. The Congress discussed many issues, including education and lack of economic resources. As a Mexican American journalist, activist, Jovita Aydar often faced dangerous situations. However, she never backed down from a challenge. She single handedly protected her newspaper headquarters when the Texas Rangers came to shut it down. Aydar decided to go to Mexico to take care of the injured during the Mexican Revolution. She served as a nurse. Aydar bravely fought the injustices in her time. Emma Tenayuca was an American labor leader, union organizer, civil rights activist, and educator. She is best known for her work organizing Mexican workers in Texas during the 1930s, particularly for leading the 1938 San Antonio pecan sheller strike. Luisa Moreno was a Guatemalan American labor and civil rights activist, where she worked as an organizer for the United Cannery, Agricultural, Packing, and Allied Workers of America, eventually becoming the union's vice president in 1941, making her the first Latina to be elected to a high-ranking national position in a trade union in the United States. She was also the primary organizer behind the Spanish-speaking People's Congress, the first national Latino civil rights conference held in the United States. Rodolfo Corky Gonzalez was a Mexican-American boxer, poet, political organizer, and civil rights activist who was a leading figure in the Chicano movement of the 1960s and 70s. He was one of many leaders for the Crusade for Justice in Denver, Colorado. The Crusade for Justice was an urban rights and Chicano cultural urban movement during focusing on social, political, and economic justice for Chicanos. Dolores Huerta is an American labor leader. After working for several years with the Community Service Organization, she co-founded the National Farm Workers Association with fellow activists Cesar Chavez and Gilbert Padilla, which eventually merged with the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee to become the United Farm Workers. She helped organize the Delano grape strike in 1965, managing boycott campaigns on the East Coast and negotiating with the grape companies to end the strike. Let me remind you, Guillermo Camarena is credited as the inventor of color television, a Mexican electrical engineer who patented an early color television system in 1940. His invention, the chromoscopic adapter, was an early color transmission system designed to work with existing black and white equipment. He also developed the first trichromatic field sequential system. Camarena's work on color television is seen as a major contribution to the field, and his invention helped pave the way for modern color television broadcasting. Mexican chemist Luis Miramontes co-invented the first oral contraceptive pill in 1951 by synthesizing norethindrone, the active ingredient that made the birth control pill effective. His breakthrough, made while he was a student at Syntex Pharmaceutical Company. Miramontes developed a new procedure to synthesize norethindrone, a synthetic progesterone derived from the wild Mexican yam. This compound was effective enough for use in oral contraceptives. Carlos Santana is a Mexican-born guitarist. Santana rose to fame in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Santana's distinctive guitar style has transcended generations and racial boundaries, and he's considered a pioneer of Latin rock guitar. To the boxing ring, talent wins fights, but discipline wins championships. Julio Cesar Chavez is a retired Mexican boxer who competed from 1980 through 2005. He was a world champion in 3 weight divisions. Known for his iron chin, he was never knocked out until later in his career. Julio Cesar Chavez had a very long undefeated streak, which stood at 89 wins and 1 draw before his first loss in 1994. This incredible run lasted for almost 14 years and is one of the longest in boxing history. Don't forget our ancestors' inventions and innovations, indigenous American Indian contributions to the world. It's our job to put our history in proper context, but you got to take it seriously. This is the fight of the century after all, so you better educate yourself and stop making excuses. You need to remember the shrieking fraud that this country is the United Snakes is a racist lie. And this concludes for tonight's broadcast. Until next time, family, and always remember our culture is a culture of resistance.